Daycare workers of Reddit. What is the most shocking family secret you have been told by a 3-year-old? Oh my. I can't believe this isn't one of the first ones that popped into my head. There was a little girl and boy, about 3 and 1. They were in foster care and had great foster parents. Well, they would get picked up about once a week by a social worker and taken to their parents for visits. Well, one time, when they came back from the first UN supervised visit, the little 1-year-old started breathing really heavy and raspy, and then all of a sudden barely breathing at all. We think maybe an allergic reaction to something. Of course we call an ambulance. Then not even 10 minuets after he's off to the hospital, it happens to the little 3-year-old. But she starts throwing up too, and then not being able to breathe. So we are all like, what the fuck is going on? The owner goes to the hospital with the kids and calls later to let us know what is going on. Turns out the real parents poisoned both of the kids. They turned out okay. The little boy had a lot more in his system and was in the hospital for a few months. But overall, everything went back to normal. Needless to say, the parents went to prison. Their reason for doing it was because if they couldn't have them, then no one else was raising them. Which made no sense because they were fairly close to getting them back. You never know how shitty some parents can be until you work in Childcare. Edit. Because so many people have asked me this. I mean the owners of the daycare, not of the children. Not a daycare worker, but I've done a lot of babysitting. When I was 15, I watched a 7-year-old whose mother worked with mine. Mom was a secretary and the little girl's mom was an APRN. I liked the kid. She was a smart girl, and I liked her mom. Anyway, one day the girl tells me that her mom's name isn't her real name. That she made it up for work, and it was like having a new mommy. I had no idea what the fuck that meant, so I tried to ask more questions, but didn't get very far as I don't think the little girl really had any idea what was actually going on. She did tell me her mom's real name though, so I asked my mom about it. She didn't know either. She was curious, so she asked a couple people at work. Turns out the woman I was babysitting for had somehow faked everything. Her name, identification, degree, work history. She was not an APRN. She had no degree. Her real name was not the name she had given. It was faking crazy. Nobody has any idea how she did it, how she managed to fake her way through that job with no goddamn training. The office they worked at was a fairly large and well-respected office in court. She was obviously fired, and I no longer had my babysitting job. Not a daycare teacher but the parent. Little one was about 3.5 when I get a very serious phone call from her daycare to come in and talk about a comment my child had made. Jump in the car and zoom there as quick as I could, and there is a police car already there. We get into the office to talk about what's happening. My child had told her teacher the marks on her chest and back were from when I beat her. Police officer looks at me and tell me this is very serious. And I'm just about to burst into tears because I can't imagine why my beautiful daughter would say such a thing. Then I remembered what was actually on her chest and back and burst out laughing like a maniac. My daughter had hives from her allergic reaction a couple of days before, and they were still slightly visible even with the cortisone cream and antihistamines we were prescribed by the doctor. Had to explain I never beat my child. She had thought that because she had hives it meant she had bees living in her, and by having to take medicine and have a special cream that I was being her to get rid of all the bees. Police officer had a good giggle and the daycare teacher looked like she had swallowed some lemons when I pointed out that only hours before I had just handed her all the proper documents, doctor's note, description of her allergy plan etc., along with the bag of cream and medication for the hives. I'm putting together a book for my kiddo for when she graduates high school called Texts from Daycare. I have taken screenshots of all the texts I would get throughout the 5 years she was there. Once I was giving her a bath. I think she was about 3, and she wanted to use my body wash, and I must not have rinsed the washcloth well enough when I cleaned her privates. It burned and I felt so bad. I texted daycare. Her daycare provider is a friend of mine whom I've known since kindergarten. That night to let her know what happened, because I knew she'd say mommy burnt my hoo-ha. The texts I got the next day could only be described as epic. She said something like mommy used her soap on my hoo-ha, and it burned and I cried. But I told mommy I know she didn't mean it, but don't ever use that burn soap again. I watched TV and I stopped crying, but then I cried again because I had hot pee and mommy felt really bad. So I said no more burn soap if I weren't so close with my daycare provider. That cold ended very badly, possibly with a visit from DCF. Another fun one, daycare provider was driving and said she'd apologized right away, and my kid pipes up from the back seat, "That's okay, my mommy says that word all the time." And she says back, quote, "Fact to the cat, I do, that cat is a faking asshole." Was working at a children's camp. There was a family of 3 very hyperactive/needy boys, 9, 7, and 5 respectively. They weren't the worst we've had, but as a trio were a definite handful and we earned the private among staff nicknames Crash Bandicoot, Mr. Menopause and Stoner Kid very quickly. Crash, because he literally threw himself into obstacles several times an hour, shouting like Tarzan. Menopause, because he threw dramatic passive-aggressive tantrums the likes of the finest just know me yell at the drop of a hat. And Stoner Kid, because he wandered around with zero awareness of his surroundings, necessitating we watch him closely to ensure he didn't literally walk into walls. It was Mr. Menopause who announced to the rest of the kids that his daddy had thrown his mommy down the stairs and she was in hospital asleep in a coma in the ICU. The other kids were asking questions and Mr. Menopause was relishing the attention and started giving graphic details before we pulled him away, cueing another tantrum. The poor kids had witnessed it. Point we learned the authorities were already involved, and that was why their maternal grandma had been dropping them off and picking them up. That was one of the less fun conversations I've had with a child's guardian. I worked in a daycare once at the university I went to, so most of the kids were really brilliant little sons and daughters of university professors. Except Anson. Anson was a dickhead. I know it's not polite to call a 5-year-old a dickhead, but this kid was the worst. He would steal everyone's sheet. He would spit on kids. He would pick up big pans of dirt and throw them on other kids. Just a terrible kid. His dad wouldn't do anything when he came to pick him up either. We would be like, "Yo, your kid was awful today," and he would go whatever and walk off with his polo shirt and his khaki pants and his faking Cardinals hat on backwards. Treno was the opposite. He was a beautiful little kid who came from beautiful amazing parents. His dad was a white guy who taught at the university and his mom was some kind of islander. I don't know what, but she was stinking gorgeous though, whatever exotic mix she was. Treno got along with everyone and was kind and funny. Everybody loved him. But on this day he had had enough of Anson's sheet. This was the last day of the semester for me, so it was my last day to work there, and Anson was taking Treno's stuff and pushing him. Treno just stops what he is doing, looks right up at me, and goes, "Do you want to see me poop on Anson's head?" Now I know the right thing to say would have been no, I know that, but it made me laugh so hard, and it was my last day anyway. I didn't care. I looked right at him, and I said yes, yes I do. To balance all this out, I have a few stories from the flip side. Point as a child, I remember several times the way my child brain phrased things matter-of-factly, or just the plain innocent nature of being a kid, lead to my parents having to explain very innocent things. Sometimes it isn't abuse or anything. I was asked to color in an apple. I colored it green. They asked me to color it right, red, and I said I did. They thought immediately I was red-green colorblind or maybe just a troublemaker. Put me in timeout, called the folks, etc. Mom asks if they ask me why. They said no and then did. I never had seen a red apple before. We only had Granny Smith apples, so that's all I knew. Mystery solved. Point probably around first grade. We were having journal time once, and I wrote a story about bugs and monsters and all sorts of little boy stuff. The school immediately thought our house must be nasty and my dad beats my mom awesome sheet, called CPS and had a meeting. Turns out, nope, I just like weird gross sheet like any normal little boy. They even inspected our house to be sure. Mystery solved. Point once we had a DARE day at the preschool, I guess to try to get kids to knock on their folks. They also covered for some reason alcohol and tobacco in this. My parents both smoke cigarettes and my dad would have a few beers every now and then, so when they mentioned we should tell our teachers if we ever see our parents using drugs, I straight up told them. After an exhaustive discussion with my parents, they realized they maybe sent mixed messages there. Mystery solved. Point in 2nd grade, I once had to explain to my mother, who got called in, as to why I was in trouble for talking about sex with girls in my class. I explained I was just singing the song we heard on the radio that morning. Top 100 radio at the time was playing stuff, and I'm too sexy for my shirt came on. It's just catchy, man. Mystery solved. I used to work in a sped classroom at a preschool. There was 3 of us that worked with 9 kids. We would take our kids to typical classrooms so they could have social time with their peers. I'm going to break your heart and then warm it. While I had one of our kids in a typical classroom one day during free play, I saw 3 kids from that classroom enacting the creation of a porno. One kid was the videographer, making gestures like he was holding a camera and semi-directing things. The second was getting dolls and undressing them. The third little boy was sucking on the butt cheek of a naked doll. I told the aide in that classroom and she just rolled her eyes. A week later I followed up with the actual teacher and she said the aide had never even told her about it. By that point, there wasn't much to be done. We had this one little girl who was incredibly sweet and adorable. There was a substitute OT came through one day that the kids had never met before. She was a very fair lady with a lot of freckles. As we're doing introductions, the little girl looks at her and she says very loud and proud she got spots. One of the aides in my classroom said they are called freckles. My mom used to call them angel kisses. The little girl looks at the OT and starts giggling, looks back at the aide and repeated, she got spots. It was seriously adorable. And one more story for good measure. We had another one little girl who would repeat road phrases that she heard the people around her say often. Sometimes it was phrases she heard us say, and sometimes it was her parents' phrases. My favorite was definitely, do you want some melatonin? I used to help my mother run an after-school program at my sister's private school. It was a very small exclusive school where everyone knew each other. The families were all very wealthy, but the shit these parents put their kids through makes my skin crawl to this day. I'll never forget one of my favorite kids asked me for help with her homework and asked if we could sit on the couches in the foyer. When we sat down, she looked down at her homework and said, "My daddy makes me watch the squiggly worms on the computer." 15-year-old me froze in shock. I asked her to start on her homework while I went to speak with my mother. Apparently the girl's mom had been trying to catch the dad forcing this poor 8-year-old to watch his tentacle born while he jerked off. The dad tried to sue us for defamation, but his wife was smart and turned his computer over to the authorities that day so we could build a case on him first. Not all the parents were this cooperative, though. My mother and I eventually had to leave the after-school program to someone else, as a good chunk of these kids were being sexually abused by their fathers, or stuck in the middle of really terrible home situations. Breaks my faking heart thinking of those kids. We were driven out of the school, and those poor kids begged us to stay, because we were all they had. Not a daycare worker, but a personal experience from my own elementary school with a kid who I supposed was sexually abused. I had a friend in elementary school who knew way more about sex than the other kids our age. When we were 9 to 10 years old, she would talk about threesomes, blowjobs, different sex positions, and show me her parents' sex toys when I was at their house. We also watched a lot of her dad's porn when we were home alone there. Her parents neglected her in many ways and the authorities kept an eye on them and would sometimes visit them spontaneously because neighbors kept reporting them anonymously. One episode I will never forget is one time where my friend's dad invited me on a vacation with only my friend, her dad and I. At that vacation, I wasn't allowed to sleep in the same room as my friend because her dad told me that he wanted to spend quality time with her and therefore I got my own room while he slept with her. I also remember an episode where my friend and I asked our parents if we could do a sleepover at her house. It was while her mom wasn't home, so when my mom called her dad and asked if it was okay I came over that weekend, he straight up told my mom that unfortunately I couldn't because my friend and him had to do some things that required alone time. I know that it's their words, but I honestly think that he abused her sexually. Especially since I started to study psychology and learned about abused kids, I realized that all the signs were literally there. Of course, I will never know, but I talked to my closest friend I've had since elementary school about this. She also knew this girl, and she said that she'd thought about it as well. Okay, not a daycare workers or the person this happened to, but it was funny as heck. Point: my sister goes to pick up her 4-year-old daughter as usual, no big deal at daycare. She gets there to some extremely concerned daycare workers and a social worker, who proceed to grill her like she was abusing her daughter in the worst way. After an hour she gets the whole story as to what was going on. Point: that day they had a guest in the daycare, a white Labrador helper dog. As all the children are petting and playing with the Labrador, my niece makes the statement, "I love Kahlua." Kahlua in the mind of the daycare and social worker being the coffee flavored liquor. At this, as my sister tells it, she burst into tears of laughter and fell out of the chair she was sitting in. She then tells the daycare and social worker that this is just a huge misunderstanding. What the daycare and social worker didn't know was that our parents had 2 Labrador dogs, black male named Kona and a white female Labrador named Kahlua. As my sister and niece were living with my parents at the time, and Kahlua had her first litter of puppies a week or so before, her name was thrown around a lot. Point: the daycare and social worker didn't believe her until after she showed them the Facebook post our mom had put up showing all the puppies, Kahlua, and my niece with them.